These common DevOps misconceptions could be holding you back in your career. But don't worry, in this video, we'll debunk each of them one by one in a simple to understand way. We'll be covering everything from why DevOps isn't just about tools and automation, to why DevOps engineers don't necessarily earn more than software engineers, despite what the figures say. A few of the points I cover in this video are from the book Effective DevOps. I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in diving deeper into DevOps culture. But first, we need to understand, what is DevOps? Imagine you and your friends are making a giant pizza together. You're in charge of the dough, someone else is adding the toppings, and another friend is baking it. If you all do your part separately without talking, you end up with a pizza that's too big for the oven or with toppings that someone's allergic to. Implementing DevOps is like creating a group chat for the whole pizza making process. This ensures that everyone knows what's going on at every step, from dough to delivery. Now yes, I know that was very oversimplified, but on a practical level, DevOps is about creating a team with a culture of transparency and collaboration. This means avoiding information silos and encouraging shared responsibility. I know, this probably sounds a bit vague, but it is very important. Tech companies love people who get DevOps, because it means that you're aligned with their culture. These companies often are the ones that are considered industry leaders in DevOps. So understanding DevOps means you're speaking their language and fitting right into their world. But all of this is useless unless you can avoid this common misconception. Let's hire a DevOps team. Imagine a company with a separate dev and operations team. The teams have different goals and responsibilities. There's a blame culture within the company which leads to a lack of information sharing. The company's leadership decides, why not hire a DevOps team? That'll bridge the gap. But what happens? There's a new team with a fancy title, but the information hoarding still exists. Plus, things are even worse now as decisions have to go through 3 teams instead of 2. Now, I've seen this point spoken about a lot and it really drives home a crucial message. Adding a DevOps team doesn't fix the underlying cultural problems within a company. In fact, without the right foundation, it might just make the problem worse. But this doesn't mean that having a DevOps team is bad. Often it can act as a catalyst for change within a company. And if it works, it works. There is no one right way of doing DevOps. Fixing communication issues means changing the working culture. For example, getting rid of information silos and destroying any blame cultures. Essentially, fostering an environment where information can flow freely. But these problems can sometimes be so deeply rooted in an organization over many, many years. I'm sure you've heard the words, this is how it's always been done. So this will require a lot of time and effort. Definitely not something you can fix by just hiring a DevOps team, contrary to what some might think. DevOps is only for development and operations teams. It's easy to see why people would have this misconception. After all, the original form of DevOps proposed many years ago did in fact want to bridge the gap between dev and ops teams. But the concepts and ideas of DevOps can be applied to any team within a company. Consider sales and marketing teams. You might wonder, what do they have to do with DevOps? Well, a lot actually. These teams are all about getting people excited about what they're selling. By adopting DevOps practices, they can work closer with the product teams to really understand what's being developed and provide real-time feedback from customers. This way, they're not just selling a product. They're part of the product's overall journey. This means that the teams work better together and the customer receives a product that they actually want. And there's also the world of consulting. By using DevOps principles, they can make sure that their recommendations don't just sit in a report somewhere collecting dust, but instead are actually implemented with everyone on the same page. Ideas and processes that encourage a collaborative working culture can be applied anywhere within an organization. You must use cloud to do DevOps. So people often think that you can't do DevOps without using the cloud. Some people think they're like peanut butter and jelly. You can't have one without the other, but it's not really like that. DevOps is about how a team works together, not where the technology lives. You can absolutely implement DevOps using bare metal servers. Now, of course, there is a lot of overlap between companies that implement DevOps and those who use cloud services. But this doesn't necessarily mean that one is a prerequisite of the other. There's no correlation between the teamwork and the culture necessary in a DevOps environment and using a virtualized environment. Now, although this misconception is quite straightforward, the next one might be slightly more controversial. To do DevOps the right way, we need to copy Netflix. Netflix is often praised as an industry leader in adopting DevOps. It all began with a major database outage in 2008. This was so severe that it prevented DVD shipments for 3 days. At the time, Netflix had roughly 8.4 million customers and 1/3 of them were affected by this outage. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just patching things up, Netflix took a bold leap. They decided to revamp their entire infrastructure and shift to being cloud native. But this isn't just about the technology. Netflix built a culture where it focuses on trusting its engineers and gives them freedom and ownership of their projects. They encourage an operate what you build culture. And this has led to them being described as the gold standard in the DevOps world. But just because one company shows off how great their DevOps methods work, doesn't necessarily mean that those exact ways will fit perfectly in all situations. The successes and failures that Netflix experienced were specific to their own problems. Imagine blindly copying someone else's homework without really understanding it. It's unlikely you'll end up in the same place because you don't understand the foundations. And it's similar in DevOps. Forcing teams to adopt certain tools or processes that might not be right for them will lead to more headaches. Sure, you can take ideas from different companies and try it yourself, but you can't expect to copy and paste the solution. I think this quote from the Effective DevOps book sums it up really well. DevOps encourages critical thinking about processes, tools, and practices. Being a learning organization requires questioning and iterating on processes, not accepting things as the one true way or the way that things have always been done. DevOps is all about automation. Now, this is definitely something I was guilty of. Before I started researching more into DevOps, I thought, cool, so it's just about setting up some tools and automations, then letting them do the work for us. But I quickly learned that it's much more. Although automation is a significant part of DevOps, focusing solely on it misses the bigger picture. For example, suppose you automate a process, but nobody truly understands all of the individual steps. When it comes time to troubleshoot it, there won't be anyone that can really support it. If the process isn't transparent and people don't share knowledge, the automation may actually make things riskier. DevOps is about encouraging a culture of collaboration between teams. Yes, it's about the tools, but not just for automation's sake. It's about using those tools and automations to encourage better collaboration. DevOps engineers are paid more than software engineers. This is not exactly wrong. This Stack Overflow survey from 2013 suggests that DevOps engineers are paid slightly more than back-end or full-stack developers. But I don't think the final salary figure gives the full story here. I came across this Reddit post that makes two great points. Unlike a lot of entry-level software engineering roles that are pretty common for new grads, DevOps isn't usually where you start your tech career. In fact, if you're looking to jump straight into DevOps, you might be finding yourself hitting a bit of a wall. There are much more entry-level or graduate programs for software engineering than DevOps. Most DevOps positions ask for something like 3+ years of experience in development or IT. We're really talking about roles that are leaning more towards the senior side of things. And as you can probably guess, with seniority usually comes a higher paycheck. So it's not a huge surprise that the average DevOps engineer earns more than the average software engineer, just by the fact that they tend to have more experience. But it's not just about experience, it's about the nature of the job itself. Now, some might argue that a DevOps team isn't strictly necessary within an organization as much as a development team is. A lot of the times, it's quite hard to get a finance or a business-minded manager to buy into the DevOps culture. But then there are those companies that decide to bring in DevOps specialists. These companies are often the ones that have a bit more financial flexibility and are willing to pay top of the market rates for a very specialized skill set. In other words, businesses may see DevOps engineers more as a nice to have rather than a necessity. So when we look at these salaries, we're often seeing figures from the companies with more money to spare and that pay more in general. This can definitely skew the salaries a bit higher. And this still doesn't really cover all the factors. This topic could easily be a video in itself. Now, I'm definitely not saying that DevOps engineers are at the bottom of the pay scale compared to other tech roles. This misconception comes from taking the salary statistics at face value. It's important to bear this in mind if you're making a career decision based mainly on pay. DevOps is only for large companies. Some people think that only large companies with lots of engineers can use DevOps, and that it's only really beneficial for these companies. I can see why. A lot of times when you're reading about DevOps, it's often around companies like Etsy or Netflix that are promoting their DevOps culture. But that's not true. Even small businesses and startups can really benefit from DevOps. These companies can ship faster and more reliably and build a collaborative culture right from the start. It could be argued that it's actually easier for smaller companies to implement a DevOps culture, as there's less friction and it's easier to move away from established processes. As an example, I watched a great video recently from Lo-Fi Startup about how they implement DevOps in their company. If you're interested in the practical side of implementing DevOps at a startup, I recommend giving it a watch. Sure, all this is good to know, but how does this actually affect a DevOps engineer's career? What if I told you that as a DevOps engineer, not everything is sunshine and roses? There's some important things you should consider. Well, click here to find out the harsh reality of being a DevOps engineer.